Okay, I think we can start now. Yeah. Okay, so good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Guillaume Vallet. I am professor of economics at the University of Grenoble, Alpes, France. And this is my pleasure today to host and to chair this session dedicated to the political economy of social change and nation building during the progressive era. Just to give you some ideas about this session, Rebeca Gomez Betancourt from the University of Lyon, France, and I are running a symposium in the review of political economy dedicated to this issue, and we decided to organize two sessions on this issue for this conference because to us the progressive era is a period of deep transformations both in the structure of economy and of society, and we thought that it could be interesting to discuss the political economy and social change and nation building during this period. So today, to that aim, we have three speakers. First, we will have Pedro Teixeira from the University of Porto, Portugal, who will present a paper on child labor. Second, we will have the presentation of Jane Knodell from the University of Vermont on the transformation effect of World War I on the US monetary fiscal regime. And finally, Rebeca and I will present a paper on Charlotte Perkins Gilman, leading figure of the progressive era. So each presenter will have 20 minutes, around 20 minutes to present his or her paper, and then we will follow by 10 minutes of question from the audience, if you agree with that. And I think we are ready to start. So Pedro, if you want to start, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Guillaume. Good to see you, everyone. And it's good that we were just saying an introduction that we still can go ahead with the AGS conference. And thank you so much to Marianne and everyone at AGS that made this possible with all this uncertainty. I have to say that this is sort of challenging paper to present because on the one hand, it's still very much work in progress. And on the other hand, because I think I have at the moment too much and I think part of the discussion will be, that probably, I think I have two papers on this and I'll have to continue working and to make it more focused, but hopefully the discussion also will serve to this. Okay, I'll start sharing. Just confirm. Yeah, there you see the one slide. So the initial motivation to do this paper was I'd been dealing with some of the debates about child labor in the late 19th century, early 20th century, because of my interest on human capital, the use of human capital, and the debates about the economic value of education in that period. So that was very much initial motivation, and I want to see what kind of arguments were used to restrain or forbid child labor. And then I knew that this was part of sort of much broader debate in the relationship and the interaction between political economists and public policy in this period. So I want to see how much case of child labor was an illustration of these broader trends, or if there was some specific issues. And well, there's sort of the upside is that I found much more, and I found out, I think, a lot of interesting things. I mean, things that have been, we knew that there's been preceding this very interesting work by Mary Ferner, by Elena Rogers, and others. but I think the risk is that there is so much that then the discussion can become a little bit unfocused, and I think that's the to think, especially because of this link between political economies and public policy. Regarding the context, well, I will not go too much into this because I'm assuming that most of those that are participating in the session have significant interest in the period. We know that this is a period that is characterized by a lot of debates about the social question, about how industrialization is posing significant social problems, how this is changing the attitudes in the US, certainly among social scientists and political economists in particular, but also there are other trends in the progressive period. I mean, in many ways, we're talking about a very, very diverse group of people that in some cases have common interests, in some cases have a closeness in terms of what they think should be done, but in other cases there are also significant differences among this group. So it's always, very problematic to talk about this. It's also a very interesting period because it's also the period of professionalization of economics in the US, the establishment of professional associations, establishment of academic departments, and the debate about what is scientific economics or scientific political economy. And this is, I think, also particularly relevant for the debates about child labor. It's also finally a period where you know that there's a growing role of the state and probably more rigorous, growing role of the government at the state and the federal level. And this is actually one of the important issues in the regulation of child labor because of the way the distribution of power exists in the US. And actually, I think that also is a very important dimension for all the efforts to advance this cause of regulating and restraining child labor. When you talk about economies in the progressive era, I will go very quickly on this, but there's several important sources regarding the debate in child labor. One is, of course, Richard Ely. I will say a bit more about this in a few minutes. But particularly this view that political economy should be embedded in ethics and should be socially committed. And this is one of the dimensions that will definitely frame the debate about child labor. Of course, in Ely, you also find the arguments about the need to regulate the market, and which is something that is shared by several important political economists of the period, certainly Eric Adams and Francis Amasa Walker. And for those that are familiar with the literature on this period, this is a movement that will converge towards the establishment of the American Economics Association and this view of ethical economics or ethical political economy. When it comes more specifically, and I think I need to go a little bit faster, when you focus specifically on the work of Richard Ely, I think it's very interesting because, for instance, when you look at his introduction to political economy, child labor is actually one of the main examples that he uses when he discusses the object and method of political economy. When he discusses the object of political economy, he talks about an ethically and socially embedded science, and actually gives explicitly child labor as one of the examples of one of the problems or one of the issues that political economy should address because of the way he envisaged the object of these fields. And it's also interesting because when you look at his reflections about the method of political economy, the idea that you should pursue an inductive method of reasoning, the value of observation, of experimentation. Again, he gives the example of child labor as one of the issues where this type of political economy has showed its relevance, not only because of the emphasis in collecting data, in documenting reality, and building political economy on the basis of this observation, but also because this method had allowed political economy, or is approach towards political economy, to show that the views of the early economists were wrong regarding the regulation of the labor market in this respect. And I think that's I think quite significant, that it shows the significance of child labor for Eli's work, and it shows how at the crossroads of child labor is at the crossroads of this double debate. One about what should be concerned, what should be the matter of concern by political economists, but also how should they study or should develop the discipline, and what kind of methods they should use. And then when you look at the outlines of political economy, then you have a more developed argument about why should child labor be addressed. And then you find an argument that those that are familiar with Eli's work will recognize, the idea that, well, child labor is the result of unfettered competition, and that shows the needs to regulate the labor market. And then in the discussion that he has about why the labor market should be regulated, he shows that, well, he argues that because of the lack of restraints in competition, this has been a race to the bottom in terms of the wages, and the fact that you bring children as well as women into the labor market, that penalize most of male workers. And therefore he says, well, this is not only a matter of let's say moral, this is not only a moral issue, but it's also an illustration why the labor market and why competition should be regulated by the government. The final remark that I would make in terms of briefly about Eli's work is how this, again, in the studies of the evolution of industrial society, comes up as one of the major evidences about how political economy can contribute to a better knowledge of society, a better knowledge of the economy, and by pursuing this through statistical work that will document these realities and help to find, not only to advance political economy as a field of knowledge, but also to propose better policy for the good of society. The other strand that I think is also relevant when we look at the progressive period, that is, I would say, less studied and in some ways more recently studied, but less covered, is, which is also relevant, is the other strand of, let's say, sort of moral and religious infused economics in this period, which is Catholic economics. Catholic economics, or Catholic social thought, is part of this ongoing debate about the social question in the second half of the 19th century, but it becomes much more visible in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, the encyclical that really starts and launches the emergence of Catholic social thought. And in the period between 1891 and the 1920s and 1930s, you have a flourishing of many authors, many compendiums that try to develop an economic approach based on these principles. And one of the important authors in this respect is John Ryan. Many will know him because of the living wage, his book on entitled Living Wage, Its Ethical and Economic Implications, which of course has important connections with Eli. It's prefaced by Eli and it's dedicated to Eli. And again, we recognize areas of convergence with the work of Eli. The debate about, again, the need to put limits on competition because of this impact of this unrestrained competition on the condition of workers, and also the living wage that Ryan is proposing is a family wage. And it's a way also of preventing child labor by ensuring that all male workers would have enough income to support his family, and therefore prevent the need for his children to come into the labor market. In his later book on the state and the church, Ryan develops further this, and he actually talks about the duties of the state in terms of the regulation of the labor market. And this sort of paves the way for kind of arguments and that will later on be used to support this growing intervention of the state in the labor market. I probably will not have time to debate because I wanted to say and to develop this because I wanted to say a bit more about the network that is associated with this kind of authors. But I'll just highlight 2 or 3 things on this. In the debate about child labor, there are various strands that I think are interesting. One is the idea that this is not only a moral issue, but it's a scientific issue. It's the idea that you need, in order to either restrain or to abolish altogether child labor, you need to find a knowledge basis for this civic action. You need to find rational and scientific arguments. You need to provide evidence and diverse types of evidence. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of this period. And I think that's also particularly interesting. And it in a nutshell, it characterized a lot of the work that this network of authors and people that are interested in this matter will develop in the late 19th century, but particularly in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And then there is one debate that I think is well, some other people have been analyzing recent years, which is the link between some of these social concerns and debates about race and eugenics, which is, I think, also relevant. And in the case of child labor, you have several references that child labor will produce an inferior race. And I think that's also a relevant debate for other issues that have been discussed in history of economics recently. But there is also other debates about, well, as I said, the regulation of competition, the impact of technical progress in the labor market, the value of the economic value of education, but also the types of education that should be provided and should be relevant in order to make these children later on as adults valuable contributors into the labor market. So all debates about vocational and industrial education. So there are many issues that come to that you will find in this literature about child labor that I think are pulling in many directions, and that I think is one of the challenges. But I would say the main issue that I think it's very interesting is that you do find that there is an attempt to develop economic rationales to justify this intervention regarding child labor, which go much beyond, let's say, a moral, an ethical, or social concern. And well, we know that this eventually will lead to significant regulation, both at the state level and then at the federal level. We know that at the federal level, this was a very controversial process with sort of going back and forth. There is a first attempt in 1916 that was struck down by the Supreme Court on the basis actually of economic arguments, the issue of interstate competition. Then there is a second attempt in 1919 that Congress enacts a law taxing businesses using child labor, that again is rejected by the Supreme Court on the basis that the Congress is exacerbating the jurisdiction and it's actually violating the distribution of responsibilities between the federal level and the state level. Then Congress again fights back and tries to sort of propose a constitutional amendment to claim legal competence, but basically most of the states will not ratify this. And child labor is finally at the federal level only consecrated its restriction in the Fair Labor Standards Act, so in Roosevelt's second mandate. So it's actually, it takes a long time for this. I I think I'm running out of time. The other thing that I basically wanted to 2 minutes to say two things. The first one is that when you try to map these network of organizations, both at the government level and by non-governmental organizations, you find two things. One is a very dense structure of organizations that will have relevance for the debate in terms of child labor. And secondly, a very significant interaction between the arguments that you find in people like Eli or Ryan, used in this very active network, especially of non-governmental organizations, trying to advance the cause of restraining child labor. You know, in the National Child Labor Committee, we'll find both Eli and Ryan. In the American Association for Labor Legislation, again, both of them are there, both together with John R. Cummins, Brandeis, and others. In the National Consumers League, again. So this, one of the things that I think is also fascinating in this is how do you see the emergence of a network of organizations that communicate, that converge in trying to promote this cause. And you see also this the interaction of these networks with the emerging structure of government agencies that will be established in the final decades of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The other thing that I wanted to say about this that is also very interesting in this network is that they will implement, both the government agencies, but especially the non-governmental agencies, many of these views about how should you approach this matter? How should you fight child labor? You should do it by finding data, by developing empirical studies that will support this social cause. So it's really a sort of an implementation of Eli's view about the subject and method of political economy. And you know, there are many resources that I use. One of them is actually present in this slide presentation. So the pictures that you're seeing are taken from the hundreds of pictures that Lewis Hine, who abandoned his academic career to actually collaborate with the National Child Labor Committee to actually to document this reality in a visual way and to use this as an instrument to provide data evidence, empirical evidence about this dimension. So it's actually, you know, it's fascinating because you see the work of many of these organizations in terms of reports, pamphlets, all kinds of activities that in many ways are providing evidence to support this action at the state and at the federal level. So to sum up, I think this is a fascinating topic in terms of the debates about, you know, the purpose and method of economics, how should you advance economic, and mainly through empirical research, about the growing legitimacy and influence of political economists, and also the link between economists and social political networks to the advancement of social policy. And I think there is a lot of in this, and I think I should just stop.
Thank you very much.
So we can have some time for discussion. Sorry.
No, you're perfectly on time, Pedro. Thank you very much. So we have around 8 minutes for questions. So who wants to start? Who has a question on this presentation?
I'll throw something out. As you're talking about the debates, and I'm not super familiar with these debates, but I'm wondering if an argument was made against child labor, that these families that were sending children into the mills, I'm sure we had a lot of child labor up here in Vermont, that they would be worse off if their children were no longer allowed to work. because they were living at such a low standard of living. The kinds of arguments that we hear today about having higher labor standards globally.
Yes, I think one of that's why I think there is one the two concerns there. One is the need to regulate labor markets in the sense of limiting competition. It's the idea that because you have children, of course, accept lower wages and are paid much less. Roughly, the estimates of that time of the Bureau of Statistics would be around half of the wages of male adults. Is that it depresses the wages of adult males. And that's why also the argument of John Ryan that when he discussed about living wage, he explicitly says this is a family wage. So you need to pay a wage that can allow these children to be properly educated and nourished, so that then when they become adults, they will have the capacity to also attain a sufficient level of income and sustain their own family. So that's I think that's also something that is very much present. And the idea that, well, if you don't restrain this, then that's what I was saying before, you have the race to the bottom. So increasingly this depresses further and further wages, which is of course one of the issues that will be addressed in several of the reports of both of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, but also the Industrial Relations Commission at that time.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your answer. Zoe, you have raised your hand. Rebecca and Bob, yeah.
Yeah.
So Zoe first, Rebecca second, and Bob third.
Yes, thanks a lot for the talk. I had a little question related to the role of the Catholic social thought in the economics of the progressive era that you mentioned. And I wondered whether in the networks and organizations you studied and you saw relevant links with the European context. That's mainly my question, or whether we should conceive the economics of the progressive era mainly as an American stuff.
Thank you, Zoe. Yes, there is. I think, I mean, for obvious reasons, in terms of Catholic economics, that would be the link with Europe would be important. But in several of the publications of Paul Ryan, you will produce an analysis of both. Should we take all the questions? Because I can get carried away.
You can go ahead, but if you can answer briefly.
You have both things. So you have both the references to, and one of the things that it does is translate some of these texts into English to show that, well, to provide support of his arguments. And secondly, he analyzes several of the European authors that have this same interest and are part of this school that is emerging in Europe, in several European countries, in France, in Belgium, in Italy, that are trying to address this. And I think that's also quite important. It's actually also interesting that I find the connection with Eli interesting as well, because in Eli's autobiography, one of the appendices is actually a translation of some parts by John Ryan of some of these views of the Rerum and the Pope about the question, the labor question. I think that's also quite interesting in terms of some of these connections.
Thank you, Pedro. Rebecca?
Yes, very, very quickly. I like the approach that is not only about one author, but to put in different authors and try to make them discuss. And my question was also related to the relation, because some of these progressive were influenced by Catholic, really, or were Catholic, but some of them were Protestants. So I think this also, I'm thinking also on the authors that I study, like Kemmerer or Fisher. They also talk about child labor, and they have other religion or religion's positions. My question was also about if, but you don't need to answer now because I prefer that Bob and Marianne also ask their questions, if there are some difference between girls and boys, and if there is some discussion, because this is something that Guillaume and I, we also have in our this debate, between the legal debate and the economic debate, the definition of what is a child, what is the legal age to work, and the importance that economic is taking in this period, and the science, rational, as you mentioned. But please, you don't need to answer. We are super close that we can continue the discussion later. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Rebecca. What we can do regarding the time, we can take Bob's and Marianne's question, and maybe Pedro will answer, making a mix of all of them. So Bob, go ahead, please.
Okay, well, I have more of a remark than a question. It concerns the American Association for Labor Legislation, because Pedro mentioned Richard Ely and John Commons, Wisconsin School institutionalists, and John Ryan, Catholic social economist. The connection was this, but I think the whole point of the American Association for Labor Legislation is it was supposed to bring together these economists with more neoclassical economists in support of an agenda of social reform. So if you look at the first 4 presidents of the American Association for Labor Legislation, it starts out with Richard T. Ely, but the second one is Henry Farnham of Yale, and then back to Commons in the Wisconsin School, and then the fourth one is Irving Fisher of Yale. So that the you're right that Ely and Commons and Ryan were all involved in that association, but the point of that association was set up to bring those institutional or social economists together with more neoclassical economists like Farnham and Fisher to present a united front in support of an agreed agenda of social reform.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Marianne, do you want to ask your question, please? Thank you.
Yes. So I'm really sorry to ask this question because I know how difficult it is to work on these guys because there's so much material and there's so many people wandering around. But it strikes me that the arguments being made for child labor and the people making the arguments were also very intersected with the people talking about limiting women's working day, like Rebecca was talking about, and improving women's working conditions, right? With women who are also dependent, right? Dependents of men at the time, and getting some of them out of the labor force. And for both the women and the children, there's a huge number of women economists at this period working on the issue. Irene Osgood Andrews, who is actually the secretary of the American Association for Labor Legislation, or like the office secretary. Her husband was David Andrews, who also did work for them. Teresa Schmidt-McMahon, Catherine Lumpkin, with a whole list of Wisconsin women who Commons was sort of deploying on the women and children's issues. But I know you have enough material anyway. But I think it's an interesting how the women economists sort of worked on this issue in particular. All right.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Pedro, if you want to answer very quickly, if you can.
No, I mainly just think, I mean, there are many things that I could say, but I think just briefly, thank you, Bob, for the comment. I think that's actually what you say in some ways also highlights another issue that is, I think, very important in this period, which is the attempts of compromise, but also some ambivalence towards how much you want to restrain the market, how much you want to develop democratic industrialism. And I think that even when you see the studies, for instance, of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics and the studies by the Industrial Relations Commission, you see that there are nuances in the way each of them approaches this, and some of them are more, let's say, more conservative in how much they are advocating. Marianne, in terms of women economists, well, I would broaden this. I think actually women play a very important role in many of these, especially in this network, in terms of the establishment of the Children's Bureau, of course, but also in several of these organizations, Leland Wald, Florence Kelly, many others, I think, play a very important role. And it's also, I think, quite significant how active they were, both in terms of developing these studies, but also in terms of public intervention. I think that's that in itself, I think, would become another paper about how. But then it raises sort of the tensions that you are alluding to, and then Tim Leonard has developed in his book about the sort of the contradictions there and the tension between the role of women that in many cases are saying, well, we need to pay more to these male workers so that women can stay at home. Rebecca, just briefly, I'll just emphasize, I think that the legal debate is very important, because one of the things that they are discussing, and actually one of the things that many of these studies that go there to the field and try to document, is not only the existence of children working in industry and in commercial activities and so on, but the enforcement of the law. That's one of the things that they are very much discussing. Said, well, it's not enough to have the law. You need to have an effective enforcement of the law, and that's actually something that is very significant. The other thing that I would say, and I need to stop it, I was expecting in some ways initially that would be less communication between some of these strands, particularly in terms of different religious strands. I was not expecting sort of late 19th century America to have this mixture between Catholics and Protestants in the way that, of course, you will find in the second half of the 20th century. And I think that's actually quite significant. And that links to Zoe's comment before. In many ways, Ryan is sort of doing this communication between sort of a Catholic tradition, but also in America, which I think is also quite significant. And we don't find, we do find references to both girls and boys, but actually we don't find so much differentiation in terms of the literature. Okay.
Thank you, and sorry to interrupt you.
No,
sorry. Thank you very much for the presentation, the questions and the answers, of course. Now we turn to the second paper of this session. So Jane, the floor is yours. I think you can share your screen. Perfect. Thank you very much. So the same 20 minutes if you can. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So this is really more of a money and banking paper than anything else. So I hope it still kind of fits within the kind of theme of the session and of the special issue. And I thank Guillaume and Rebecca for organizing the special issue and also this session. So this paper is about the effect of World War I on the US monetary fiscal regime. So over the course of the 20th century, and particularly after World War II, was created the fiscal monetary regime that we're all generally pretty familiar with, in which Federal Reserve, this is all US, okay, Federal Reserve banks create high-powered money, monetary base, by purchasing US government debt. Now that does change after the global financial crisis, where they get back into purchasing private sector debt, namely the mortgage-backed securities. So this is really kind of relevant up to that, global financial crisis, which I think is having another round of kind of transformative effects on the fiscal monetary regime. So that's the role of the Federal Reserve banks, while the depository institutions create the inside money, and they buy both public and private debt, and they hold reserves. They have reserve requirements. Those are maybe getting phased out, but they're still going to be holding reserves, that is reserve balances at the Fed, to make payments to other banks as a final settlement vehicle. Now, this setup is really not at all what Congress had in mind when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. And clearly the Fed was like one of the signature accomplishments of the progressive era. And it was really created to stabilize the banking system, is why we thought we needed to create this thing. And all of the debates were about how best to do it, and would the, the banks themselves largely run this new entity, or would it be the government or some balance therein? But in what was set up, the Federal Reserve banks would discount commercial paper, private business paper that was presented to them at the discount window by member banks, and provide Federal Reserve notes really as a supplemental currency to provide the elasticity that was lacking before the creation of the Fed. The member banks would hold these Federal Reserve notes, but also the same legal reserves that existed under the National Banking Act, and they would provide the transaction deposits and currency. The main point I want to stress here is that the Federal Reserve money was supposed to be based, in their concept, on private sector debt, not US government debt. So this presentation is really focusing in on how World War I, the mobilization for World War I, brought about lots of very big changes in the setup of the Fed in a very short period of time. And I'll start by talking, most of my comments are really about the Treasury's role in the monetary system between 1879 and 1914. And then I'll talk some about monetary mobilization before I conclude. But like Pedro, this is very much a work in progress and kind of working, so I welcome your comments. So during this period, the Treasury was basically a quasi-central bank. And post-Keynesian economists have done some really interesting historical work where they say, even where there is no central bank, a banking system is going to kind of generate, internally to itself, some way of kind of managing the monetary system. And by the late 19th century, that should of course be 1879, sorry, the US Treasury had taken on these central banking roles, in addition to managing the receipts and expenditures of the federal government. So the services included monetary stabilization. There's a lot of nice work showing how the Treasury kind of did some counter-cyclical stabilization within the constraints of the gold standard. And they also really maintained the stock of high-powered money in many respects, which is what I want to focus on here today. So let's just look at the components of the stock of high-powered money in, say, 1894. Okay. And at the end of the presentation, I have my sources. And I use a lot of just governmental sources in putting together this presentation. So of course, first of all, there was the gold coin and the bullion, and the Treasury operated the mint where the gold was assayed to make sure it was, at standard, where the bars and coin were produced to standard. The Treasury, and that gold itself, physical gold, comprised 32% of all the reserves, legal reserves held by national banks. So national banks were, of course, a subset of the entire banking system, probably about half of the banking system at the time. But they're the ones that are, operate under laws set by the federal government and have a centrally important role in the Fed in the early days. Then there were these gold treasury certificates. So of course, gold is expensive to move around, especially if you're trying to make a very large payment with gold. And so the US Treasury started issuing certificates against deposits of gold with sub-treasuries that were located across the country. So in the same way that the Fed has district reserve banks, the US Treasury had sub-treasuries located across the country where that performed a lot of these monetary services that I'm going to be talking about. Then there were these gold certificates issued by clearinghouses. The US Treasury had no role with them, but had the same idea that final settlement was going to be in gold, but instead of just moving all this gold around, we're going to all deposit our gold, get certificates, and then we'll clear with each other using the paper certificates. Silver dollars still weren't quite done yet. The late 19th century, most people know who study this period, silver made a little bit of a comeback, and there were silver dollars, again minted under the authority of the US government. again, certificates issued against these deposits of silver, and then fractional coin made up a very small amount. So together about 10% of all the reserves that were held by national banks. And I'm just guessing most of those silver dollars were held in the West. Okay, finally, this is continuing. Lots of different pieces of different assets were in the high-powered money. The US notes, also called legal tender notes, also called greenbacks, which of course were the currency that was used to finance the Union government's effort in the Civil War. But after 1879, all these legal tender notes are payable on demand at the US Treasury. And they're about a third of all the reserves held by the national banks. And then finally, there were also certificates issued against deposits of greenbacks. And this was basically, these were very large denomination notes that were more useful for banks, that were issued against the deposits of smaller denomination notes. So you see this, the US Treasury is exchanging forms of money, they're moving money around, they're taking on the job of kind of storing these vast, in their vaults, all this gold and silver. Now, by the end of the 19th century, the Treasury Secretary is, Secretary is like not happy about this, So he says, directly quote, says, while the laws have imposed upon the Treasury Department all the duties and responsibilities of a bank of issue, and to a certain extent, the functions of a bank of deposit, they have not conferred upon the Secretary any part of the discretionary powers usually possessed by the executive heads of institutions engaged in conducting this character of business. So they're feeling that this is kind of really interfering in their ability to operate. So in what sense was the Treasury a bank of issue and deposit? So when you look at the Treasury reports from this period, they all have these reports showing their available assets and their net liabilities. So they're very concerned about the net liabilities, which are their promises to pay, and how much liquidity they have to meet those liabilities. So they're holding physical gold, physical silver, and lots of these, the paper forms of reserves that I just mentioned with the national banks. And the gold certificates, the silver certificates, the currency certificates, these Treasury notes of 1890, which were also payable into silver and later gold. And then also they have an agency account there. So the US Treasury had to stay liquid enough to credibly promise convertibility of these paper claims, not state bank notes, but virtually all the other forms of currency, into gold on demand at the fixed price, which was $20.67 for a troy ounce of gold. And that was something that was very much on their mind. The Treasury was vulnerable during banking crises. In 1893, there was one of them, we had the period of recurring banking crises under the national banking system. There was a fairly severe one in 1893. The custom revenues were down and a federal deficit developed, which was actually a bit unusual for this period, which I'll talk to in a minute. And the Treasury covers that deficit by drawing down its cash balances. And the banking community and the markets are kind of following, how much free gold does the Treasury have? And the free gold is the gold it owns net of the gold certificates that is issued against that gold. And as the free gold fell, there was the threat of a run on the Treasury, and there was a run on the Treasury in the form of increased demands to redeem the greenbacks and the Treasury notes into gold. And the Treasury responds by suspending the issuance of additional gold certificates to preserve the Treasury's gold holdings. So the public is seeing the Treasury, right, as the holder of, the most liquid asset. And the Treasury is kind of seeing the public as, like a threat to its ability to, maintain convertibility. There's a lot more to be said about that episode, which I may get to in my paper, but the Treasury, basically ends up needing the cooperation of the New York banks, the big New York banks, to avoid suspending gold payments. So the stability of this regime really rested on federal government surpluses. And if you were going to have deficits, they needed to be small and temporary, which they basically were during much of this period of time. So in the period between 1879 and 1891, the federal government ran surpluses averaging 30% of federal expenditures over the business cycle. In the 1890s, a period which included, the crisis of 1893 and also the Spanish-American War, there were deficits that averaged about 7 to 10%, which were not large in relationship to the Treasury's net cash holdings. And I, show you that like in 1893 to 94, there was a deficit of 75 million. Its net cash holdings was about almost twice that. The federal government also could and did issue bonds to basically restore its cash holdings. So they would sell bonds to get gold back from the private sector, which we may think of as kind of an odd reason to issue debt. So of course, the federal deficits of World War I were not small and temporary. So now we're getting into World War I itself. In early 1917, the monthly federal deficits exploded from $20 million to 1,000 million or $1 billion by year end monthly. And of course, the US entered the war in April of 1917. And before that, there was much anticipation that this was coming. If you look at the, and McAdoo, who's the Treasury Secretary at the time, is saying, we could never have financed World War I, without the Fed, without the changes that we made to the Fed. So if you look at that, was that really true? Well, Treasury net cash was 300 million, so it's a big number, but small. Obviously that's just that would be you would run out of that cash pretty quickly. And the excess reserves of the national banking system in September 1914 were about $30 million. That only goes so far. And even if you think, well, the total banking system were about double that, clearly there was not enough excess reserves to expand loans that much within the rules of banking at the time. So soon after the US entered the war, the Treasury issued short-term debt called certificates of indebtedness. So there weren't yet short-term Treasury bills. And by year end, they've issued 4 billion of them. They've retired some of them, but they're issuing large amounts of short-term debt. And the question is, who bought them and how did they do it? And it became quite clear that the rules of money creation under the 1913 Federal Reserve Act significantly limited the potential for monetizing this much debt. And there were some major amendments adopted in 1917 that are laid out in the secondary literature that kind of fixed this problem. And these were amendments that were brought forward by the Federal Reserve Board. And of course, the Treasury Secretary was the chair of the Fed at that time. Treasury Secretaries were the chairs of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. So these amendments, little complex, but they made more of the gold that was owned by the Federal Reserve banks, and there was a huge influx of gold into the U.S. economy in between 1914 and when the U.S. entered the war. So in that respect, the U.S. was kind of benefiting from the hostilities in Europe. But the amendments make more of this gold available as reserves. Now that we're still on the gold standard, so we're still in this mindset that the notes, currency has to be good, it has to be payable on demand into gold. It allowed the federal banks to lend to member banks on the collateral of U.S. government debt, which was not allowed under the original Federal Reserve Act. And it also required the member banks to hold their legally reserved reserves as deposits at the Federal Reserve banks, not as notes, not as Federal Reserve notes, as deposits. And all the stuff that they were holding was you can still hold that, that's just your vol cash. your legal reserves have to be on deposit at the Federal Reserve banks. And this leads to a lot of movement of the ownership of the gold itself into the Federal Reserve banks and into the US Treasury, which is part of what they're trying to do.
Jane, sorry to interrupt you. Can you go progressively to your conclusion?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
we're running. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm at 17 and a half minutes, right? But I'll get there. I'm very close.
Thank you very much.
So I can skip over the details about how these certificates of indebtedness were actually absorbed into the banking system. But the short of it is that the Federal Reserve banks basically lent large quantities of new reserves to the member banks on the collateral of the debt. So what's the significance of 1917? There's a lot of institutional adaptation and innovation that facilitated very large scale and fast conversion to a war economy. So we have the first use of these war loan deposit accounts that are going to be very important in World War II as well. Federal Reserve debt is used as collateral for high-powered money, not just inside money, which was the case before the creation of the Fed. There are still all these monetary obligations of the Treasury outstanding, but over time, more and more of them were owned by their own fiscal agent and not the private sector. The Federal Reserve is really well on its way now to becoming an engine of state, providing the monetary infrastructure required of a major nation state. But I guess here's the political economy point, that the Congress would never have created such an institution in 1913. There would not have been political support for centralizing, consolidating so much national power, so much financial power in the national government, which of course was the reason why previous central banks had been killed, either by Congress or by presidents. So I will conclude there. That's the end. And let me figure out if I'll stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Jane. It was excellent. Thank you very much. So we can turn to the questions now. Zoe, do you want to start? You have raised it was before. Okay, Rebecca, you have a question. Sorry, Zoe.
Too much money in banking.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say that I my sources, and I guess I did have one final slide. I looked a lot. I guess the thinkers, economic thinkers that I used were really people that were in government. So I use a lot the annual reports of the U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve bulletins that start after the organization of the Fed, the annual reports of the comptroller of the currency. Are all very interesting reading. I'll get that into the paper that I submit to kind of get a sense of the on the ground challenges that people were facing. And it just, so those would be the economic thinkers that, I think are relevant to this topic.
Thank you, Jane. And maybe, yes, I would start for asking you a question. What are the specificities of the American case? Did you try to compare it with other countries? You know that I have in mind the Swiss case, for instance, but how was it elsewhere? Do you have any clue on that, or?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I guess most of my thinking would be to compare it with the, say the Bank of England, kind of the early prototype for subsequent central banks. The internal organization of the Fed, I think, as we've talked about, and the internal organization of Swiss National Bank have some similarities, which I think are very interesting, and could be something we could explore in other work together, possibly. I haven't talked to Guillaume about that. So, but it just has also always struck me that there's interesting similarities between the Swiss case and the US case. But of course, the Bank of England was also, was really from the get-go set up to support the central government and to help it, finance itself. And whereas that was not the case in the US, but of course became the case over time.
Thank you very much, Jane. Yes, Roger, you have a question?
Yes, in the First World War, when these changes happened, was there any expectation, or was the argument used that, well, we're going to revert to the old system afterwards? Because presumably war was not expected to continue forever. So, and I'm just thinking, whenever in the Napoleonic Wars and in the First World War, when the Bank of England had to change the rules governing the currency, there was the aim of returning to the old status quo ante afterwards. Was that argument used in the United States?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. I need to learn more about it. Of course, after the war, they start to, they're drawing down the debt, but they're continuing to issue short-term debt using those same institutions that were created in World War I. And by the end of the 20s, they kind of say, oh, we should change this, but, more because of, kind of just mechanically, it was not as good as just auctioning off treasury bills, which is when they start doing that in the late 20s. But because the amendments of 1917 did not have the Federal Reserve banks lending directly to the US government, which was just kind of the Rubicon we shall not cross. In some sense, they kind of, skirted around that and made it maybe a little more politically palatable, but that's something I need to learn more about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both for the question and the answer. Yes, Max, you have a question. Maybe it will be the last one because we have to turn to the last paper.
All right, yes, I enjoyed that enormously. And thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing your work with us. I wanted to ask about some recent debates among American historians, historians of the United States, that is, about this period. A couple of authors, including Adam Tooze and Sven Beckert, have recently suggested that in this period, there was an enormous fear on the part of Europeans about American power, and that in general, global politics, geopolitics, strategy, something like that was being reshaped by the ascendance of American power. On the other hand, some Americanists have said that, in fact, the US state remained quite weak, and it's easy to exaggerate the significance of military, economic power, however you'd like to construe the concept of power. And I guess your work seems relevant to that question, and I wonder if it's one you've thought about at all, or if you have any opinions on it at this time.
Thank you very much, Max. Tooze I'm not familiar with Beckert, but people have said, you got to read Tooze. I think that it probably took time for the full potentiality of, kind of the US growing economic, fiscal, military power to kind of fully manifest itself. And, from the monetary side, I'm kind of wondering how long did it take for it, the assets of the Federal Reserve banks to be only US government debt. I think that took some time. So I think World War II has to be part of the story from just the monetary fiscal side of things. But probably I'm not a geopolitical thinker, but probably World War I just kind of was a little bit of a taste of this is what it means to be a major player, and we kind of like it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So we can go now to the third presentation, Rebecca and I's presentation. So Rebecca will start and I will conclude. Thank you, Rebecca.
Can you see the screen? Can you see me?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so let me put the timer, then I don't speak too much. So thank you for being here. I wanted to go to Tresh to see you, most of you, but we are here, and next year we're gonna see you in June. So this paper is part of a larger project that I have with Guillaume on some women as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and in particular in a notion that we are going to define in a minute that we call business ethics. And this is from some of her writings, because as Marianne and Bob and in other articles by O'Donnell or Agnes in Agnes Letolecker dissertation, we can find some of Charlotte Perkins' contribution, for example, on the American institutionalism, her contribution to American institutionalism economics, for example, in Marianne and Bob articles, and for example, in Bob article published in the American Economic Review, he explicitly say that Gilman was like a landmark for the studies in women and economics. So for us, this is a very important figure that has a lot of different aspects in her personality that contribute to her theory. She was a poetry, she was a novelist, she was a painter, she's selling soaps. She moved from the east of United States to California and became an activist in social reforms. She was very known in United States. And she was, for example, delegate of the National American Women Suffrage Association. And this is something that comes also from her family. One of her aunt was a suffragist. And also she participated in International Socialist and Labor Congress. So this is in the continuity of works introducing mainly by Bob and Evelyn, Bob Damon and Evelyn Forget in their books and in their articles. So she is a very complete figure of this progressive era, because she is at the same time feminist. Some in the literature, some authors consider her a utopian feminist. She is also considered a reform Darwinist. She is a pragmatist, and there are many articles on this point. And in Lyon, in my lab last week, there was a presentation on Gilman and Dewey and Adams on pragmatism. She was a Fabian socialist and a US nationalist. So there are many aspects that we can study in her writings, in her works. For example, all the changing in the economy and the women's status, the social status of women through the different reform movement. And one of the most known is the dress reform movement. So it's probably most of you know some of these aspects. We focus in these 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 texts, because her bibliography is huge. There are letters, there are archives, there are manuscripts, and in particular among these texts, because probably one of the most known among economists is Women and Economics, but we focus on social ethics, sociology, and the future of society. And this is a text that, for example, in the article by Marianne, publishing the biographies of women economics, she didn't really exploit this. So we say, okay, let's to work on this text. So she explicitly say that the global emancipation of women, political, socially, and economically, depends on their access to economic independence. She really put the focus on the women salary, the woman independence, economically speaking, in their purchasing power of money. She said that this itself functioning of changing the domestic economy, but also this will promote new type of enterprise. However, this economics change can only occur if there is a new ethics. Okay, so she says these two elements. We need economic independence and we need a new ethics. So our aim in this article, that is also pretty much a working paper, is to show that in her writings, we can find what Guillaume and I we will call a business ethics, which implies that economic production, the economic system should be a common concern. And this must be subjected to a social ethics. Okay, so for her, all the economic system needs to be part of a common goal, of a common objective, and this needs to be subject to a social ethics. So this business, what we call the business ethics, refer to the economic of the home, but also to the economic that is related to the economic of the homes, that is in society, in big businesses or societies. For her, there were two key issues. First, an economic one, and this is why I asked before to Pedro what was the status of the economic question, the economic arguments, because for her, very explicitly, and Marianne and Bob also write about this, she explicitly said that we need to increase global economic efficiency and we need to pass through the markets. And this, the second key issue was the social issue. She said we need to promote social links, social bonds, and to improve reproduction of races for the sake of the US nation. This is linked also to her vision of evolutionism. So we will present very quick in three parts. First, her portrait as a figure of the progressive era. So her big battle during the progressive era was to propel the economic independence for women. She talked about the new women, which for her implies to analyze the economic of the home in relation to what characterized this period, androcentric culture of institution, mainstream in academia in the United States. And this is something that Golding in different writings, she, with a lot of statistics, she shows that before the 1920s, most of the positions were highly gender segregated, were not open to women. And for instance, for example, in the American iron and the steel industries, employees were 115,000 male workers for only 2 women in all the country. So these things are things that you know. What she analyzed from the very end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, was that she was really aware that women start to be part of the labor market. They are already working outside of the home, but she observed 2 problems. First, the increasing number of working women that did not hide the strong concentration of women at home, particularly once they get married. So they still staying at home when they get married. And second, if they obtain a job, they are generally bad jobs. So these bad jobs that don't let them to advance, to progress in their career. This is something that is also explicitly that we can find in the Women's Bureau of the Department of Labor. For example, when we read professionally working women were concentrated in very few industries, such apparel, food, tobacco, which accounted for 3/4 of all women in manufacturing jobs. When women were confined to this small set of function, to these few industries, this exclude them to other kind of occupation. And this was in the late of the 19th century, Barbara Bodichon, and these we can find in Bob and Evelyn books and also in some articles in History of Economics. That is what later we call the crowding hypothesis. It means that the women earned lower wages because they were concentrated in too small number of jobs. So these markets were super crowded and their wages still very low. So this is a waste, and this is Perkins Gilman, a waste of economic resource, both for women and for the country. And she said, this is a global loss in productivity. United States is losing because it's not including the works of these women. And she said, women alleged weakness, supposed weakness, is make them worse workers and make them also worse mothers. So it's like women were judged for both. To finish and to give the floor to Guillaume, I wanted to say that she really commented on motherhood. She really commented in the economic role of households as a production unit in the economy that was declining, and that the fact that the family should not longer have a central role in the women economic activities, and the women, like men, should turn to other activities outside their homes. So she showed how to change this economy to include these worker women. So how to do it? What is to be this social ethics for Gilman? And then I pass the floor to Guillaume.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Please, Rebecca, tell me if I am running out of time. But yes, it was very important for Gilman to turn to social issues, even to turn to sociological knowledge to coin and to devise a new principles. Even though she was not trained in sociology, she was very close to eminent sociologists of the time, especially Lester Ward. And to her, it was important to analyze moral decisions affecting women, because it was about it was about dealing with democracy, of course, and she was very involved in the suffrage movement, for instance. But it was, as Rebecca stressed, it was a matter of changing the conditions of women in the home and in the labor market at large. And this is why she turned to social ethics, voicing for a more cohesive society in which each individual would depend on one another. This was very important for her, because at stake was the issue of of improving the whole dynamics of society, and of being able to devise the good and the bad for each behavior. So to her, in order to devise such a good and bad behaviors, it's a matter of science, and ethics is the science of behaviors, is the science of conduct, as she said. And for instance, this should include analyzing kind of moral hygiene, as it was the case of many thoughts of the time. Because it's a matter of improving as I said, the global dynamics of society, and the betterment of each individual. We can go to the, So yes, the most important thing is to think about how to improve the life of each individual and of the society taken as a whole. And this is why she tried to connect several institutions in society in order to devise different types of ethics. But the most important was, once again, to connect all these different types of ethics to the global functioning of society and the global improvement of society, what we call here the common good. So yes, ethics is then a social matter, and this social matter is evolving over time, because the nations, the American nation was building at the time, and to her it was important to be able to devise principles to have a kind of social control on it. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, she was of course close to Lester Ward's ideas, but she also was influenced by his friend Edward Ross on this issue of social control. And we can say that she became increasingly close to his ideas at the end of her life. So yes, to turn now to this connection between social ethics and her pioneering economic ideas, she had in mind to reframe, to redesign the macroeconomic production system of the American society. And when we are talking about here about the macroeconomic system, this includes the connection between the economy of the home and the economy of other institutions. And to that aim, as we have said at the beginning of the presentation, it's important to get rid of the idea that women are economically dependent on men. We have to create new activities enabling women to change and to be at their right place in the productive sector. And because it's a matter of improving the conditions of women, and to Gilman, it's important because if women have a better job, they will be able to be a better mothers, and this was very important for Gilman. But it's also a matter of promoting a new and a new use of capital, in the sense that we have to rethink the way we use collectively the capital. This meant for Gilman trying to rest on the capacities of large but regulated companies to supply more efficiently the services and the goods, especially those hitherto produced by women in the home. But it was also a matter of socializing the means of production when necessary. And on this point, she was very influenced by Edward Bellamy, for instance, or by Fabian socialists, especially when she went to England at the turn of the 19th century. So yes, this promotion of the collective use of capital was very important, was paramount in order to improve the reproduction of race. I think this is what she really had in mind at the time. It was her main focus, and this was connected to the improvement of women's economic condition, because once again, motherhood and maternity, better motherhood and maternity was the key issue to her to promote a new American race, as she said. Yes, we can pass this. Thank you very much, Rebecca. So to turn now to the conclusions. Yes, we can say that we have very preliminary findings because, as Rebecca said, it's our first draft on this. But just to remind you a few points. Of course, Gilman's views are connected to eminent leading feminist figures of the time, whom she was in contact with, Jane Addams or Ellen Stuart Campbell, for instance. We could also have mentioned her familial connections, because I think Gilman was very influenced by her aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe, especially on the issue of marriage. Yes, there were many connections, and to her it was also important to turn to science. There were real breakthroughs at the times on the scientific organization of labor or of production, and she was really aware of that, and this is why she wanted to devise new principles of society relying on this scientific breakthrough. And yes, this will be the last slide, my last slide, but we can say that Gilman argued that political rights will follow from economic changes. Maybe this was very important at the US of the time, but this view was not shared by every feminist, and maybe this is what is very innovative in Gilman's thought. It was not the case in France, for instance. When you take Bertine Auclair, she thought that it was the opposite. Economic changes will follow from the improvement in political rights. So I think her thought, Gilman's thought, deserves more attention, and we have tried to stress today that the economic emancipation of women is very important, because it's important for women, of course, but it's also, and maybe above all, it's important for the collective well-being of a given society, and it will launch improvement for all. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, I'm just on time, perfect. Thank you. I have been maybe too quick at the end, but I wanted to finish on time.
Thank you. Yeah,
So
it's the
thank you
same
very much.
time for everybody.
So we have 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes for questions. I don't know if the session will close automatically at the end, or no, we have time. Okay. Jane, yes, you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you. Very, very nice paper on all the papers. Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, I was thinking it would be great to like hear some of the modern feminists, what they think of some of this, because some of it has very, I just think it would be very, in some respects, very controversial. But it's interesting to me that among the progressive economists who are trying to bring about, good progressive changes in labor standards, that they use these efficiency arguments a lot. That this is really just about creating a more efficient economic system. And do you get the sense that that was like a strategy, or it's really core to their thinking? Was it a way to kind of bring more people into their cause, or is it an integral part of how they're thinking about economy and society? And it does kind of seem like she's saying that, women are underutilized in the home. It's a waste of this resource to have them just in the home doing these things. And in the modern kind of caring economy literatures, would probably have a very different take on that.
Do you want we collect all the questions? Guillaume?
Yes, maybe we can do this. Yeah, good idea.
Thank
John,
you, Rebeca and Guillaume. I have a question that follows on Jane's question, which is maybe you can tell us a little more about the household side of children reproduction and education. Is she arguing that more social, or is she arguing for a communal raising of children that would be more productive? Sometimes we have difficulty relating to the thoughts of a period like this, but is there some like more productive, more scientific, childhood raising possible?
Pedro?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And I think actually one of the things that I think your paper also highlights is that, you show a progressive dimension of progressive period, and also how diverse the period is. And I think that's also, and in some ways how contradictory the views are, and the tensions that exist between some of these positions. The question I had is, when she develops these arguments, is she using any kind of evidence or data to support these views, or because she was a novelist, I believe, or what kind of resources she's mobilizing to persuade the readers about views?
Any other question or comment? No? Maybe I start, Guillaume, very quick, and then you finish. It's okay for you?
Perfect.
Okay, so for Jane, first part of the question about what modern feminists think about hair. Actually, there are a lot of articles published in feminist journals or different kind of supports, reviews, blogs, Twitter, and also a lot on pedagogy, psychology, philosophy, and maybe the others are published in sociology. But not too many in economics. And recently we can find some debates about her position as feminist. And this is linked also with John's question and maybe also with Pedro's question. I am very much interested in her biography, because she also wrote an autobiography that she really keep writing until the day that she committed suicide. It's like we have in front an author that write fiction and not fiction parallelly, and that is arguing for some ideas that she is also applying for herself. She was very open sexually. She was with women, with men. She, for example, about kids and education, she got divorced very early for the time at the end of the 19th century. And then when her daughter was 9, she sent with her dad. She was really aware of the importance of maternal role for women, but she said this is not something that is genetical or typical, that needs to be only for the people that born women. She was, for example, very in favor of avoid any kind of cliche of male aggressivity, for example. So she, for her time, as Pedro say, we have a person that is very characteristic of the progressive era, and at the same time, very avant-garde. So we are here almost making the link between Perkins Gilman and the generation that come just after. For example, in California, at Berkeley, in the social economics department, and the home economics movement later. But maybe Guillaume wants to say something more.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Just maybe I can add some things that I have in mind. But first, I think, yes, she was really aware and concerned about the issue of the waste of resources, as you said, Jane. And I think sharing this with many other progressives, she had in mind that the economic wealth must serve the whole society. We have to think about how to produce better and more, but we also have to think about a new kind of distribution of these resources. And to that end, this is my hypothesis, this is what I have in mind, but I think she was fascinated by by large companies, by the potential of production of larger companies. The idea to increase the scale of production, to her, it was one of the solutions of the time. So I think this is a kind of ambiguous thing in maybe her thought, in the sense that she wanted to rest on the ability of this, the capacity of these big industries to promote wealth, but maybe these larger companies were also a kind of threat to the democracy at the time, and including the issue of regulation. So yes, to me, that's very important to refer to the growth of larger companies at the time. Regarding the issue of children, yes, she wanted to rest on the scientific knowledge to create a new kindergarten, to create a new nurseries, even to create to promote higher education at school for children. This echoes what Pedro said in his presentation, because to her it was a matter of improving efficiency, of course, but it was also a matter to offer children a different model of education that they have in their family, and once again to be aware of the nation of their belonging to the nation, to the American nation. So it was very salient. It is very salient in her thought. And finally, I think she, regarding Pedro's question, she mainly rested on her views, because yes, she was a novelist, she was a writer, but she, even if she didn't bring evidence using specific methods, but she was in connection with so many eminent figures of the time that she used their experience and their data to forge her ideas. I have mentioned Lester Ward, but it was the same with Bellamy. She mentions a lot Veblen's work also in her writing. So there were some ideas that were shared at the time by her and with other scholars of the period. This is what I can say and had.
Yes,
Well,
not too many statistics, not
No,
too many.
no, but by the way, actually, and related to what the comment that Rebeca, you made on the chat, I mean, field observation, field work was also very important at that time. So many of these organizations actually promoted these kind of activities, you know, going around the country and documenting this. This was also important to show, well, this exists, and they would do exhibits of some of these things, and this way, in the same way, the photographs were also very important. So I think that the use of these resources and this information in novels, I think is actually very much that fits the zeitgeist.
Sure.
And
Sure,
yes,
I mean,
and there is a kind of, oh, sorry, Rebecca.
No, in particular, in compared, for example, to Fisher, to Kemmer, to Mitchell, that were very much into statistics, into calculation. She was a lot on the psychological side, trying to talk to the people. She was very shy. She has this marvelous book, the yellow wallpaper about illness in women. So her contribution is really about like the humanity and the problem, women and men at that time. It's not based on the statistic, it's based on these feelings.
Yes, there. I think to add some things on this, there is a kind of a narrative approach in her writings, in her thought. There was a kind also of reflexivity to use what Rebecca has just said, because she mainly rested also on her own experience, especially when you look at you look at her autobiography, you can find examples when she was living in New York, or she's mentioning some of her trips in Maine. So that's very interesting to know more about her life. And this is very useful to her to use this data, this narrative approach, yes, to coin her ideas and her main concepts. Okay, so I think that's fine for this.
Sorry, I think Max had raised a question about the
sorry, I didn't
biography.
see. Oh, sorry. You have a question, Max? I didn't see.
I was wondering if a good biography has been written of Gilman.
To me, which one do you have?
I think this one is one of the best. I mean, her autobiography is just incredible. The letters, many of the letters were published, but this one I think is one of the best. Is very well known, is Cynthia Davis. Sorry, because here is already the evening, so I have the light. Cynthia Davis, and it's Charlotte Perkins Gilman biography, but there are many. There are a lot of biography, but this one is relatively recent and is very complete. It's 2010. But I can send you, I mean, we have, and maybe Bob, he knows all
there's a biography by Anne Lane. There's one by Mary Hill. There's a 2-volume edition of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's letters. There's a lot of biographical material out there.
Thank you for attending this session. Thank you for the comments. We keep in touch about our project because we have another session on Sunday. You are more than welcome to attend. See you soon and hope to see you in next year in June.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the speakers, the audience, and the organizers of the session. Thank you very much. Let's get in touch. Bye-bye. À bientôt.
Good session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci à tous.
Thank you. See you soon.